Hello, and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear AI researchers chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll provide summaries and discussion of some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did and did not cover in this episode. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Sharon Zhou.
And I'm your other host, not a doctor, Andrei Kurenkov. This week, we'll be covering a usual range of stuff. We'll be talking about how ML tools can predict post-op complication and surgery duration, how they can eliminate accents in phone calls, some new research on AI-designed cameras with selective recording of objects, and AI for dating archaeological remains. We'll have a couple of stories on deepfakes and generative image synthesis, and we'll finish off talking about stable diffusion and just how crazy good text-to-image models are generally these days. So it should be a lot of fun.
Woo! All right, let's dive straight in. So in applications and business, our first article is machine learning tools predict post-op complications, surgery duration. So research here suggests that actually approximately 7 to 15% of major surgery patients are actually expected to experience a major complication. And a third of hospital expenses are actually spent on care to prevent these complications, which can be life-threatening. So researchers and clinicians came together and gathered and used information to predict surgical complications using machine learning. But actually, in general, this is actually a very difficult task because there isn't actually that much data. There's a lot of missing data on the perioperative period, which is just the time before and after a patient is in surgery. And this information can include that related to demographics, history of comorbidities, lab tests, medications, clinical notes, and physiological signals, along with hundreds of other pieces of data there. So to address this challenge, this research team of clinicians and machine learning researchers actually began to develop a deep learning approach using a variational autoencoder, a VAE, which they call a clinical VAE. And this they use to reduce the dimensionality of the data while still capturing relationships among the original perioperative variables. And then they use this to be able to predict whether patients would develop post-operative delirium as a specific thing, and also one for predicting the duration of the surgery. And they looked at, 562 clinical variables, and they were able to, quote, compress that into 10 variables using this VAE, which looks fairly standard. And also, they do make it into an acronym of called CVAE, which to me looks like conditional VAE. But yeah, so this is using not a new approach at all, but like applying it to interesting data set here that does very much affect surgery.
Definitely, yeah. And it's interesting, this article also notes that this is really another study that's adding to a growing body of research showing the potentials of AI to enhance this notion of predictive analytics in medicine. So last year, researchers at Thomas Jefferson University developed a model for predicting complications such as kidney failure and stroke. There's also work from University of Florida that was also about predicting complications. I think just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about predicting sepsis or kind of perhaps diagnosing it. So it seems like this is a pretty kind of broad application area within medicine, just kind of predicting how things will go and what sort of complications might arise. And seeing all these papers come out of it and show that this is viable is definitely exciting. It seems like, maybe it won't take too long for this sort of stuff to be integrated.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think it still might take some time to deploy something like this, but I'm glad that there are so many different angles and nooks and crannies that we can use machine learning for. And that, there's just data everywhere now. And using this data and figuring out how to use this data is super important.
Definitely, yeah. It's fun how it seems like we talk about medicine very often in this
Yes.
application section. So that's always fun. But on to something not related to medicine or saving lives. We have the story Sanas, the buzzy Silicon Valley startup that wants to make the world sound wider. So this is about the startup Sanas that aims to currently make call center workers essentially sound white and American, no matter the country they're from. So if you have a call center worker in India who has an Indian accent when speaking English, this is using an AI filter to make them sound sort of the standard accent of American English, however that can be defined as. And it is doing quite well. So since launching in August 2021, they already got 32 million in Series A funding, and they already say that at least 7 outsourcing firms have already deployed their products in their call centers. And eventually they want to expand beyond that to even consumer video and audio calls and maybe film and TV. Just a lot of applications where you can modify an accent to make it different, which of course, the appeal is business-wise is there, pretty easy to see, but there's also been some criticism of kind of forcing people to sound white. So what do you think, Sharon?
And the title of the article was, pretty spicy itself. But indeed, they do spend quite a bit of time on the critique. So people, they say on the surface, this tool reflects communication difficulty, basically people not being able to understand other people's speech. But really, it's, quote, coded for a whole bunch of other issues about how accent triggers racism and ethnocentrism. And that was by Professor of Sociology at the Washington University in St. Louis, who's done extensive research on call center workers. And, a service like Sanas, they argue, likely would not help call center workers, even with a flawless synthetic accent. It doesn't cover up that outsourcing exists or that the call is probably not in the United States. It just doesn't solve the real problems of outsourcing. So even if the workers' voices aren't triggering racist harassment, they're still subject to a culture of harsh surveillance and little autonomy. So what they're really getting at is, the fact that while this does cover up the accents and, tries to get at some of the problems with outsourcing, it's really just trying to put a Band-Aid on the problem as opposed to really solving the root of the problem, is the main critique here.
And that's a totally reasonable critique, I think. Like, obviously, as a business, it will sell this, happy story of improving the experience of call center workers as the main motivation. But ultimately, this is a business that, will try to make money by catering to the companies that want to maximize profit. So it's true that we're not trying to solve these underlying issues. But at the same time, I can't help but feel that even if they aren't trying to solve those problems, they can alleviate them by, for instance, making it so the workers themselves don't have to learn to whitewash their accent and adapt to this American accent, which currently a lot of them do. So even as a Band-Aid, I feel it's better to have a Band-Aid than nothing at all, personally.
Yeah, I also don't expect a startup to be able to solve everything, especially the giant root cause of it immediately and initially. It's quite a large ask. So I'm excited to see where this goes. And, I don't know exactly where the startup is trying to take things in terms of their vision. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I also say that this was founded by 3 former Stanford students. Maxime Serebyakov, Sean Zhang, and Andrei Perez Sodero. And those names are all clearly by immigrants. And I do feel like, if you spend time around immigrants or have yourself been an immigrant, being understood is a real challenge when you're trying to speak with a heavy accent. And even if you have interacted with immigrants, you can know that sometimes it is difficult to understand and you're doing your best, but it may be an issue. So I do think there is a space for this to be also useful for immigrants and language learners and people who have difficulty communicating, and that, making that experience easier.
Yeah. And Sean was actually in my lab.
Oh.
Working with me, actually under me. So, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And on to research and advancements. AI designed camera only records objects of interest while being blind to others. So this is based on the UCLA piece of research titled "To Image or Not to Image Class-Specific Diffractive Cameras with All Optical Erasure of Undesired Objects." So what does that mean? This new research paper, which was published in eLight, basically showed that you can do something else to preserve privacy when you're imaging by basically building a fundamentally new type of camera. And that camera is, modified by AI, where AI is making small modifications to the hardware while it's taking a picture to then mask certain objects and not other objects. So I thought this was a very cool piece of work because, up until now, imaging, it's kind of like post-processing of, based on what the camera sees, we can then decide whether or not, our data, has something, and then we show it privately or not. And there are all sorts of techniques there. But for many of them, you can still recover what the hidden things are. And we don't want that. We want certain things to actually be hidden. And in this case, we're able to do that. So it's able to, let's say you only want to see, in their case, they were looking at MNIST, which is a handwritten digits, and you only want to see the number 2. So it'll only see the number 2, and every other number it'll be masked out, and you can't tell. And you can't recover it because in the data, it's just irrecoverable. It's just like a black space there. So I thought this was a cool piece of work, and they largely only tested it on a couple small data sets, but I think the direction is promising. They tested it on MNIST, the handwritten digits, and also fashion MNIST, which is looking at fashion objects like trousers.
Yeah, I agree. I was pretty blown away by this whole idea of not creating software, but using software to design actual hardware, actual lenses that make it so the camera basically cannot capture certain shapes. And the obvious use case here is for privacy reasons, to kind of blur faces now instead of blurring faces manually using software or post-process. Like you said, this can be, from the first place in recording, impossible. And you can imagine you can make whole new cameras, or probably you could just make lenses also that are privacy preserving. So really, really cool research, and hopefully we'll see follow-ups to this that go beyond MNIST and towards like faces and things like that as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes, because I do think if a camera is made like this, it could mean a very big difference in how we think about privacy, vision, and surveillance.
Definitely, yeah. And our second research article is AI-based methods for dating archaeological remains. And this is about the paper, Temporal Population Structure, a genetic dating method for ancient Eurasian genomes from the past 10,000 years, which was published in Cell Reports Methods. So the whole idea here is that obviously you want to be able to date ancient humans to be able to map migration and other patterns throughout world history. And then the standard dating method is radiocarbon dating, but it's not always really reliable. So there's other problems that could result in vague and contradictory results with this method in terms of how the quality of material is, for instance. So this paper introduces a new method that instead of using the ratio of isotopes in material, uses the DNA you gather from the sample. And then it turns out that using a machine learning method, you can predict the age of the sample from the DNA, which makes it this really completely different type of dating method. And they show that, in the range of 10,000 years ago. So they really focus on this late Mesolithic period of 10,000 to 8,000 BC through to modern times. And they use a dating training data set of 5,000 human remains and show that this works. So another kind of application of research to application of AI to another scientific discipline, which is seems very cool.
This is a very cool scientific discipline to be applying it to, archaeology, essentially, right? And be able to date it. They have a pretty complex diagram of the different components of what they're doing, but it looks like they're using both supervised and unsupervised methods to train this model. But it does look like a fairly simple set of models.
Yeah, the models themselves are pretty standard. It's not even deep learning. So the complications here are really in how do you get the data? How do you filter it? How do you make the learning work? Which I think we've seen pretty often in these sort of interdisciplinary works where the method, the model is pretty standard, but there's a lot of details about the nature of the data and how it is put together that is more field specific, which is interesting.
And any kind of applied approach will see this as a challenge where data is really the big challenge and less so about innovating on the model. And versus for AI research in particular, at least up until a bit ago, it was, there were just existing data sets that you could use like ImageNet where you wouldn't have to prepare your own. But in reality, I think a lot of applied AI or AI used for products are largely based on what we understand in the data and how we work with that data that is real and dirty and messy.
Yeah, and it's interesting also to note. I think it's cool that the paper analyzes existing publicly available data with all this post processing, and they published all their original code in this website called Data Triad, which has this hosting of data. So seems like other researchers who might want to be able to date human remains from this period can go ahead and just get to code and the model and use it. So that's really cool.
And onto our policy and societal impact section. You just hired a deepfake. Get ready for the rise of imposter employees. So companies have actually been complaining more and more to the FBI about prospective employees using real-time deepfake video and deepfake audio for remote interviews, along with PII, personally identifiable information, to land jobs at American companies. And so there's, one thing that these fake, candidates or actually companies are doing is that the way they get PII, this personally identifiable information, is that they post fake job postings, and that enables them to get basically harvest job candidate information and get other people's resumes who are real. And that's what they're doing. And it's pretty intense because these candidates are sometimes, and then on the candidate side, they're using various different apps to go from a photo to deepfake video. And largely all of this is just for espionage into different company systems. It's for money, it's for unearned career advancement. And so it's kind of crazy how this is now a huge, part of the complaint sent to the FBI, and it's really just a perfect job for spies, in particular spies for the North Korean government, which according to a statement by the FBI and the U.S. State and Treasury Departments is that some imposter candidates actually work for the North Korean government. Because of U.S. sanctions, North Koreans are actually they're not eligible to work at American companies. And American companies can be actually fined about $330,000 for each violation. So then the North Korean government thinks, okay, well, I'm going to go around this and actually lets people apply and work as imposters in exchange for taking actually most of their salaries. And North Korean spies get jobs under false identities just to steal these secrets. And some use their real identities but claim they were outside of North Korea. So pretty crazy. Candidate fraud has nearly doubled, according to Glider AI's Future of Candidate Evaluation report since the pandemic. And, these cyber attackers or hackers are just getting hired under stolen credentials just to gain unauthorized access to sensitive data into systems inside of companies. And if someone has, tech skills, IT skills to get some job, they can also do so. And that could be very dangerous in a company as well.
Yeah. Wow. This is pretty dramatic, especially the details about the North Korean government, where they do have a lot of hacking, targeting other countries famously. And yeah, it seems to be a big threat. Of course, social engineering is in practice one of the main ways to successfully hack, basically fool people instead of write some hack for code. And this does seem to make it easier. So it's really interesting how, the concern used to be mostly misinformation and fake news and so on with deepfakes. But this particular example of using deepfakes to essentially do espionage, hacking, seems to be much more of a realistic present day threat that is playing out in practice. So, I really wasn't kind of aware that, it seems like this is already kind of a big deal and is only going to become more commonplace soon. Well, we have another story on deepfakes right after this one called Deepfakes for All, Uncensored AI Art Model Prompts Ethics Questions. And there's another AI story. There's another news story that's quite related called This AI Tool is Being Used to Make Freaky Machine-Generated Porn. Which, that's what this is all about. So we've talked about how Stable Diffusion has been released. Now, a week ago, it was fully released, the model, and it was also in beta where you could use it through a GUI. To recap, Stable Diffusion is essentially something like DALL-E 2, but instead of being closed behind an API, they decided to pretty much open source the trained model and the package to use it and other things like that. And that means that they don't have any filters. Once you download the model, you can do what you want with it. And that includes generating not safe for work images, including porn, which has apparently quickly become the case. There's examples on 4chan and on Reddit where there's been multiple subreddits already dedicated to Stable Diffusion, NSFW, or porn diffusion, all of these kinds of things. And, we've talked in the past about how this is a general concern with deepfakes, that this has been done. This was the real kind of problematic aspect where people have been using it to generate synthetic not safe for work images. That includes real people like celebrities and sometimes even partners. So yeah, now that whole thing is coming back into vogue with these incredibly powerful models that for now, like DALL-E 2 and Midjourney did not allow for this. And it wasn't really possible to use deepfakes in this way, but now we can. And it seems like maybe could lead to some problems. What do you think, Sharon?
Oh, definitely some problems. I guess it's not that surprising that these initial things have come up, especially since OpenAI was being pretty stringent on what they allowed or didn't allow, to be generated, and so now it's all basically loose and out there, and so we'll see. It really depends on what people want to see, how they want to create. So I think a lot of it is because what started the internet. So
I mean, this is not unexpected, but it's still kind of tricky. And this article does go into how maybe pretty much the main thing to expect now is that platforms that host images like Reddit or, for instance, Patreon may need to just deal with this problem of deepfake, not safe for work imagery. And Reddit, for instance, has banned these new subreddits that were dedicated to it. And their, terms of service actually do forbid it. So going forward, that might be kind of what will have to become the new norm.
Right. And I mean, people, given that the weights are completely open and people can just generate things almost, ad infinitum, so a lot can be done if there are no restrictions on it. So it's interesting to see where basically this goes. It is very tricky. And I think a lot of the user interfaces out there right now are not supporting the not safe for work kind of application. But, the weights are out there. So if you do run it on your own machines, it's totally doable.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the actual GUI website tool by this company, Stability AI, that developed Stable Diffusion, does have these filters. So yeah, it's not easy to do this necessarily, but definitely doable. And I think in general, it's interesting to witness how much of a huge event the release of Stable Diffusion has been. So all these articles are basically in response to it. There was a blog post on multimodal.art titled 1 Week of Stable Diffusion that just covered how much has happened, where multiple websites that allow text-to-image generation like Night Cafe or Midjourney have already incorporated it. There's already plugins for Figma and Photoshop to use it. There's new package features to do videos, for instance. So it's just really blowing up and leading to so much new work and follow-up work on top of this open source model that really just showcases how much of a benefit, even if there are these sorts of ethical concerns, how beneficial it is to allow other people to build on this work, I think.
And on to our art and fun stuff section, and very much related to Stable Diffusion. So first article is, here's how the best AI art generators compare. So this is an article by Fabian Stelzer, who describes himself on Twitter as a, quote, prompt intern, working on 3 AI-based projects, and compared using an experiment different text-to-image AI art generators, including Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2, and Midjourney. And what he did was he just entered the same prompts into each tool and used a 1-to-1 aspect ratio for the images. So the prompts range from, and I'll just read them out, low poly game asset, Cthulhu monster, 2000 video game isometric view. That's one. And another one is 1990s clip art of a laughing crazy fax machine, Windows 3.1, MS-DOS, early computer clip art. And so giving really crazy results and very, very descriptive prompts, which is really interesting. I guess it really establishes Fabian Seltzer as a prompt intern. And he shares this mega thread on Twitter comparing how these different tools produce these results. And his summary was that Stable Diffusion seems to produce the cleanest results. Midjourney does really good at creating painterly textures, which Midjourney did say of themselves before. There's some funny little things, like if you just put the word art into a prompt, Midjourney goes a little crazy. It starts being, very artsy. So just very interesting stuff. DALL-E 2 produces the most photorealistic results. You can imagine, based on, what's coming out here, what data each of these models are using, and how they're thinking about what their tool is for. And it's just so interesting to see how each of these models is actually quite differentiated in a way.
Yeah, for sure. He says these image synths are like instrument. It's amazing. We'll go so many of them, each with a unique sound. And what's really fun is, you don't have to take his conclusions. You can actually just look. He posted these really, well formatted images where you just have the three things side by side, the same prompt and the outputs, and you do get to see how each one has its own sort of character. DALL-E 2 definitely is better at more photorealistic things. Midjourney is very much optimized to be more artsy and sort of evocative, and so on. There's these various distinctions, and I do think he is right, and this is a good metaphor, that each one is a musical instrument that can be used to kind of hit the same notes, so to speak, but have a different character. It means that basically it's not just about, you can do text to image. You can really learn each individual synthesis tool and its quirks and how to get the result you want out of it, which is really cool. And of course, we can't really describe all of this using words, all these images. So again, check out the link to this in the description of this episode or on Last Week in .ai, where we will have the link as well. Which one of these comparisons did you think was the most fun here, Sharon?
Oh, the most fun. Well, I really personally liked the one that was a human anatomical heart made of flowers, pastel, matte masterpiece. And I just felt like they looked very different. So Stable Diffusion honestly just looked like an arrangement of flowers in the shape of a heart, sort of, And then DALL-E 2 was actually the anatomical heart structure, like that you see in science class, with flowers on top of it. And then Midjourney, I think, was like the most integrated of those two. It was, there's something that looks anatomical about it. It looks almost disgusting in terms of the anatomical part, but then around it was all these flowers. So it didn't look as gross, but I don't know. It was just interesting because it felt like I could see semantically very different things, and I could see how it was getting at it in different ways. That being said, I think all of these are all, cherry picked from each of the models. And so, each of the models can produce many different images, right? So it's also hard to say to compare this way.
Yeah, I think you definitely need to play around with it for quite a while to get the general feel of things. Midjourney does tend to be more dramatic. Let's say DALL-E 2 is maybe more realistic, but it definitely depends on the context. Personally, I found it kind of fun that there was a prompt on mathematical art, 1924, lithography, abstract generative art. So you're using a generative art AI tool to make generative art that is like old school programming based. And again, you see very, very different outputs from all three. And it's just fun to see, the variety. And I think there's probably more variety across these tools than within one tool if you had multiple outputs. So yeah, really fun thing to take a look at. And speaking of comparing all of these text to image synthesis tools, the next and last thing up here is something we did related to that. So I and Sharon and a friend of us, a friend of ours who writes science fiction, have started this little project called Stories by AI, where we just wanted to explore using GPT-3 and using voice synthesis tools and using these text to image things, how we could use them to write short stories and illustrate short stories. And we just released, I think, our 6th or 7th story, this great filter button. And what was really fun is now that Stable Diffusion came out and Midjourney was opening up, actually for generating the images for it, I just went ahead and played around with all 3 and, mixed and matched and kind of saw what worked. And I would say it definitely seems like for different outcomes, I found that using a specific tool like DALL-E 2 or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion kind of made the most sense. So I kind of like this previous article does speak a little bit to my experience just for this one little project. And Sharon, you've been generating a lot of these images before for the other stories. How would you say that experience has been so far?
It's been so interesting because I think what we both found was that, if you just grab a quote from the story, you can actually get something very interesting. So you don't have to even design your own prompt necessarily. You can just get it from the story, which was already AI generated, right, by GPT-3. And so it's just so fascinating that now we can very much streamline this pipeline and be able to create these stories. And there is a bit of obviously human lift where we're doing a lot of this, but it's been so illuminating because I remember just a few years ago, quite frankly, like 3-4, where I was, I had this dream of a student project for my students to create a children's book. And it was actually quite hard to create it. And especially, we were looking at, continuity across the frames, which, here we're able to do. We didn't do it continuity here, but, this is kind of like, these are real stories and they're actually interesting. So props to the AI. And I think this is just the start. It's not perfect, but it is a start, and they're actually engaging now, which is super exciting.
Yeah, definitely. We've been doing this for a couple months, and already there have been these changes. Initially, we just used DALL-E 2. Now we can use Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion has come out, and who knows what will come in a month or two, right? And who knows what happens with GPT-3 or these other things. We've been seeing also progress on that front. So yeah, it's been really fun to do this project and keep exploring this sort of space of human AI collaboration. It seems like maybe something that the listeners of this podcast would find interesting, especially given all these other stories this week about text to image synthesis. So maybe check it out if you want another example of what these tools can be used for. And again, we'll link to it in the description.
And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at lastweekin.ai. And do subscribe to our Stories by AI as well.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. So check it out. As usual, we would like to beg for some reviews as well and some feedback. So we actually got some new reviews that have been pretty cool. So we got a pretty positive one, and we got a slightly critical one, 3 stars.
Wow.
Very useful. And
very useful.
This was about how I needed better microphone setup, better audio, which was totally fair, and I adjusted my setup, so hopefully it's better this time. It's funny, I actually have a nice, expensive microphone. I just didn't bother, looking into how to optimize the usage, so that really got me to do it.
Now's the chance.
Yeah, that got us to do it. So if you want, if you have suggestions for improvement, we will definitely listen. You can email us at contact@lastweekin.ai. You can leave a review on Apple, whatever. So yeah, we appreciate feedback, and whether it's negative or positive, it would be much appreciated.